Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Will of the Phrenic by C.J. Aaron, narrated by Eric Michael Summerer. Prologue. The wind was biting, even by the standards of the normally blustery coast. The gusts knifed their way inland, skewering clothing, stinging any exposed flesh. Ledral tugged up at his collar, seeking to protect his unprotected neck, though the effort produced little relief. At least the briny tang of the Sea of Prosper overwhelmed the stale odor of ash and death that had become an unwelcome yet consistent visitor. His eyes scanned the moonlit horizon to the south. The rolling sea sparkled as it was jostled by the tumult of the wind. The shimmering reflections flashed for a moment before being swallowed by the turbulent waters. Frothing waves pummeled the breakwater blocking the port. Along the seawall that stretched the length of much of the city, they slammed against the stone, splashing over the cobblestone road that bordered the water. There were none to complain as the spray and surf escaped the sea, soaking the road. The city was a ghost town. At the late king's bidding, the horde, the demons from the wastes of the outlands, had butchered all in their path. The wails of men, women, and children echoed through his brain, a perpetual torment that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. He shuddered at the memory. The agonized cries still pierced the inner reaches of his mind. He doubted they would ever silence their anguished cries. They had saved those they could, those who would listen to their pleas. Still, it was only a precious few. The loss of life far outnumbered the meager numbers of the survivors. Generations had been snuffed out in the span of a single evening. His vision tracked to the west. The walkway atop the southern palisade stretched for nearly 15 miles, though it was only a few dozen meters before it was swallowed by the darkness. Pinpoints of light, torches or lanterns of the roving patrols, dotted the walkways and towers, their watchful eyes trained on the endless darkness beyond the security of the sheer, solid walls. Cadsay, the meager namesake of the port city, only a few moons in the past had been nothing more than a meager settlement inside the gates that the tributes called their seasonal home. The village now was nearly unrecognizable. A vast tent city, a sea of cloth habitations, swelled around its outer edges, pushing its boundaries further into the stocks. Though the night was nearing its middle, there were still many about in the maze of its newly constructed avenues. Only a few thousand citizens had survived the massacre. They were accompanied by an uncertain military force nearly 8,000 strong. Though he had served as the captain of the guard overseeing the garrison of Cadsay proper for cycles, many in his newly constituted army were strangers to him. Their motivations undeclared, if all but publicly. There were few he could trust. Their numbers dwindled by the day. He had the disconcerted feeling that he was little more than a prisoner inside the very walls he'd defended for cycles. His motions were planned with care. His routines were broken for the sake of unpredictability. Even in the deep of night, he moved about under heavy guard of those he could trust. Ledral sighed as he scanned the horizon to the east. Nothing moved throughout the darkened shadows of the devastated city. The seas, though agitated, had seen no vessels since Ryle and his companions had departed with Lord Ellegar's fleet. He had felt the loss of security keenly as the disguised warriors made their clandestine departure. Though nothing had been announced, their absence had likely been noted. Grumblings from the soldiers, though said with uncertainty, spoke of their disappearance. He had learned to give heed to the rumbling of the men-at-arms. There was often a glimmer of truth, a nugget of intention in their conjecture. Ledral's gaze stopped when it reached the eastern horizon. He squinted into the darkness, following the discolored shade of the Kingsway into the distance. Though far too early for the first of the sun's rays, the land glowed with a wavering, dull orange. His body involuntarily tensed as the patrol approached along the top of the wall from the east. The clomp of heavy boots and the muffled slapping of scabbards on the legs of the armed soldiers echoed through the night. He felt the presence of his guards as they constricted around his position. The lead of the incoming patrol held a torch out in front of his body. Even in the darkness, Ladrol could tell the man was tall, standing nearly a head above him. The voice that lilted through the night was authoritative, yet missing the curt tone that was so commonplace among the officers. He recognized the timbre immediately. His hand moved from the pommel of his sword. "The horizon burns," came the voice from the dark. "Aye, Captain Cypri. They've moved closer, likely just beyond the crest of the hill now," Ladrol added. He felt the tension ease as the loyalty of his peer was unquestioned. The captain had followed Lord Ellegar on a fool's mission, knowingly risking all in defense of Ryle, in defense of the tributes. They had arrived in time to be the saviors of what remained of Cadsay proper. He walked with a small contingent of his men, though there were a few unmistakable cloaks of the vigil mixed among their number. "The dedication of our fealty is expected tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken," Cypri intoned. "Has there been no news from Ryle?" "None was expected, though the fact that the ranks have thinned substantially over the last few days speaks clearly. His penchant for causing trouble has grown legendary." A small yet genuine smile pulled up on the corners of Ladrol's lips. "The force is sizable, roughly equal to our own if the scouts are correct." Cypri stopped, leaning his lanky body against the stone crenellation, casting his vision back to the east. "I fear the force from within will be far more troublesome than the army outside the walls," Ladrol whispered as he moved to the officer's side. "Aye," Cypri groaned. "We could certainly use their arms. Their presence will be missed." "We pile more on their shoulders daily," Ladrol sighed. "What we have will have to be enough. We will weather this storm on our own." Cypri nodded in silent assent, though his mind clearly struggled with a thought. Ladrol smiled at his fellow captain. A stranger until a little over a moon earlier, the man's loyalty was unquestioned. His command over his troops and the respect they paid him in return were a welcome sight. "Speak freely, my friend," he offered. Cypri grinned as he nodded again. "How will we know that they were successful in their task?" A note of concern flashed across the face of Lord Ellegar's captain before returning to its usual stoic norm. Ladrol thought for a moment before responding. In truth, it was a question that he'd struggled with internally, not wanting to voice the concern for fear of giving the thought life. "The mere fact that the army massing to the east has thinned speaks to the prospect that they may have already found some measure of success." His voice was hushed, loud enough for only the captain at his side to overhear. "We will not know the truth until their party returns. Fear not. You, better than most, understand the devastating power Ryle alone holds. Given the impetus, he could likely raise the kingdom on his own. Coupled with the other Phrenics, I have little doubt they'll allow a result that is not of their liking." For a few moments, the two captains said nothing, both seemingly lost in thought as they surveyed the ruins of the razed city. Their respective guards formed a wall around them, granting a measure of peace. Momentary though it was to be. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through their hushed reverence like thunder. From the west, a solitary runner approached their position atop the palisade. Breathing heavily, the guard offered a salute before standing tall, awaiting the captain. Even in the dark, Ladrol could see his eyes cautiously survey the group that surrounded the captains. The man and his loyalties were known well. "What news?" Ladrol inquired, returning the salute. "Captain, the common house, the signal," he gasped between breaths. Though the reality was long understood, Ladrol felt a pit form in his stomach as his eyes turned toward the swelling village of Cadsay. He stalked across the top of the wall, leaning against the inner railing, studying the interior. His vision tracked along the row of 3 common houses set in the shadow of the eastern palisade, the original homes of the tributes. At the final building in the group, a solitary figure leaned against the outer wall, just to the side of the door. Ladrol watched for a moment as the character made himself comfortable, seemingly gaining a measure of peace from the crowded confines of the congested dorm. After a few moments, his hand nonchalantly worked the shutter on the lantern in apparent idle fidgeting. The pattern of flashes was unmistakable. "Captain Cypri, rouse your troops," Ladrol grumbled. His eyes were fixed on the rhythmic pulses of light from the common house. "Send riders to collect the Phrenics. It's time." Chapter 1. Ryle held his hands out, waving them slowly before the flames of the meager campfire. The heat was present, yet it seemed to reflect off his body, doing little to cut through the chill that had lingered for days. His skin acted as an impervious barrier to the rejuvenating warmth of the blaze. The icy sensation was all-encompassing. It was a chill that coated every fiber of his being, a bitter drop in temperature, like being confined to the darkness of a thick, black shadow. He was weary. They'd pushed hard over the past 2 days, yet there was still a considerable distance to cover. The sails of Lord Ellegar's armada had long faded into the distance. There was no fleet he trusted to hasten their return to the stocks. They were all mounted, though they moved with consideration for the horses that labored to carry them to their destination. Though days had passed since leaving the capital, they had been expectantly detained in Laramont. The reverberations of their actions still echoed through the royal city. With the hasty departure of each tainted noble, with the retreat of every gilded entourage, the dramatics faltered slightly, yet the uncertainty lingered. It was a palpable sensation, hanging over the city like a cloud. Few who had attended the deliverance remained long beyond the moment Tev destroyed the last vial of the blessing. They had witnessed the madness, the taint of the Nexala taking hold, turning Lord Cagrin into a demon. The self-appointed regent had fallen on his own son with claws and teeth as the darkness he'd allowed inside, the greed, took control. The audience, the lords and ladies of the kingdom, vaunted heads of the great houses, fought amongst each other like savages. Ryle had provided the son of the self-appointed king the choice. To his surprise, Tev had proven more empathetic than what was to be expected. Though only time would tell his fortitude, he saw no deceit in the young man's eyes. His words lacked the undertones of distrust and greed that were ever present among many of his peers. True to his word, the army of his house had followed his command. There were dissenters, yet they were few in number and volume. The power play that would descend upon his house from within would be crippling, yet for the moment his control over the capital was secured. Riders had been dispatched to all corners of the kingdom, bringing word of the changes that had rocked the foundations of Damaris. The ascertaining decree, the testing, the confinement of the tributes would be no more. The road to freedom from persecution was long and winding, yet the seed had been planted. It would take nurturing to grow. Ryle feared that it would be watered by blood. He looked up from the flames that had captivated his attention. Onder waited a few meters away. A mild look of concern graced his features as he watched. "You haven't heard a word that I said, have you?" The mercenary approached as Ryle slid to the side, making room on the stump he used for a seat. "I'm sorry. I hate to admit I didn't even notice you were there," Ryle groaned. The distraction, his shocking lack of attention, was disturbing. The fear that followed in its wake jarred his system back into its normal preparedness. His heart thundered in his chest. He frantically scanned the surroundings with his mindsight. All was as it had been moments earlier. The same disturbing image greeted his vision. The glowing, golden signatures of the Phrenics glimmered like beacons in the darkness. He noted the faint aura of the boy, Potter, as he huddled close to the group currently resting at the edge of the tree line behind him. A great mass of charcoal signatures remained motionless only 20 meters to their west. The individual forms were tightly grouped, appearing as if they were one single unit. The Lee Guard waited where he had commanded them to remain. Ryle looked down at the black tattoo that covered his exposed left arm. He flexed his fist, watching as the markings shifted in response. The line of black crept slightly upward, shifting upward, away from his knuckles. "You should get some sleep, Ryle." The hints of fatherly concern that tinted the mercenary's voice were potent. "The Phrenics will stand guard. I will stand guard. You needn't shoulder this burden alone. Ryle smiled at the statement. He appreciated the sentiment, yet he knew the notion was far too enticing to fully entertain. With a tingling wave of sensation, the agitation rolled through his body. "There is no one else to bear this weight, Ander," Ryle snapped. He immediately felt the pang of regret, as his words were unjustly harsh. He inhaled a deep, steadying breath, calming his internal upheaval before he responded again. My friend. I'll rest soon enough," he sighed. "I'm sorry for the tone of my voice." Ander grinned, placing a hand on his shoulder. No words needed to be said. The compassion and support in his eyes spoke volumes. Ryle was keenly aware of the weariness that had seeped into his bones. Though his body still rippled with energy as the elixir coursed through his veins, they struggled to combat the chill of the darkness that had taken over, that he'd allowed to assume control. "The Lee Guard have shown no signs of questioning my command. The authority I've asserted over them is finite, yet there is far too much to risk," Ryle groaned. "They are but a fraction of the dreaded army that they once were. Still, we are drastically outnumbered. Were they to defy my order, were they to test my lapse in direct control, even in the daylight we'd be hard-pressed. Unarmed as they currently are, they are still lethal. I fear that in the darkness, few would survive the onslaught." Ander frowned, averting his gaze to the fire at his feet. He kicked idly at an errant ember that had long since escaped the flames. The Lee Guard had been disarmed, yet they were unbound. The black-cloaked guard had followed Ryle's orders without question. When they moved, their group plodded ahead of him and his companions, a great black wall that stretched across the road before them. They rode in silence, verbally communicating with neither each other nor any outside their number. When the group rested, the Lee Guard quickly tended to their mounts, devoured their rations of food and water, and slept in neat, orderly lines. There had been little they could do with the score that had fallen to Ryle's blinding energy at the onset of the deliverance. Though their group was large, numbering nearly 300, they traveled light and fast. There were no menders among their group. There was no space to carry the incapacitated in that number, to house the extra rations needed to sustain their comatose bodies. The 10 who had survived remained in the capital, placed under heavy guard and medical supervision. There was no telling if or when they would rise. "All the Phrenics will be awake shortly, Ander," Ryle added. His voice carried a weight, an annoyed force that disturbed him as he listened to the sounds issue from his mouth. "As we discussed, I'll rest then. A few hours will be enough." Though he spoke with an emphatic force that was undeniable, internally the struggle remained. The chill was all-encompassing. The whispers, the vile temptations to paint the surrounding landscape with blood had swelled to a roar. In the brief interludes when he'd relegated the darkness within, inverting the markings on his skin, his ears had whistled with a high-pitched whine. Allowing the now stained sun of his tattooed left arm to shine was mildly comforting, yet there was no disguising the lingering reminder of the sheer volume of the darkness that resided within him. The weight of the shadow threatened to crush him. The elixir in his veins struggled to maintain their foothold against the mounting pressure. At times, it seemed that it was through sheer will alone that he remained in full control of his capacities. The perpetual presence of the darkness had clouded his mind. He still rippled with the lingering sensation of a far-off call. Though separated by hundreds of miles, it was as if the voice of the Erlin rang in his ears. Her airy voice whispered on the wind as she called to him from afar. The ancient forest would again prove to be his savior. Ander's gaze remained on him for a few moments. The tension of his close observation was grating. Ryle repressed the feeling of annoyance that bubbled up in his core. From deep within, a whisper cut through the rage of the darkness. It was lucid in its intent, yet the voice itself felt sour, tainted by malevolence and hate. It reacted to Ander's words with supreme distrust. Ryle shook his head, forcing the offending voices from his mind. He knew the look on his face was pained. He understood that the mercenary above anyone else would comprehend the expression. "We need to make haste," he whispered. "I will rest fully when we reach the Erlen, when they are safely in the care of the woods." "That will be several days' journey at best, Ryle," Onder noted. "We make good time, yet it will likely take a week to reach the shadow of the woods. That is without delays." Ryle grinned at his mercenary friend, the man who in all the world knew him the best. "I'm certain that we will meet a contingent of the army," he admitted. "Yet every moment that passes where we don't encounter their group makes me fear more for the safety of the stocks." They had encountered a scarce number of stragglers traveling along the road. The majority of those who crossed their path were guards. The soldiers spoke of the dissolution of their mixed force. Their army had been sent by Lord Cagran to bolster the initial force that was encamped within a day's march from Cadsay proper. Many heeded Ryle's exaggerated warning that the self-appointed regent was usurping the powers of their houses. Though the pretense by which the message arrived was untrue, he had little doubt that the greed of Lord Cagran would have one day sought to accomplish the feat. The doubt and division he prodded had been long sowed in the minds of the force. It had festered. With his subtle assistance, the mood had soured beyond repair. Guard turned against guard. The overwhelming concern for their house's prosperity and power outweighed their loyalty to the regent who had claimed control after King Lunek III's demise. With no bloodline to follow, Lord Cagran had usurped the throne, claiming it by the might of his greater numbers. Few, aside from those within his own house, approved of the action. Even fewer of those who comprised the reserve army sent to bolster the first trusted his word. Some of the divisions among the force had turned violent. Few had been killed. Ancient rivalries reared their heads, yet mass combat had been avoided, as the desire to protect their lords and lands was now paramount. "We will undoubtedly meet some resistance before we reach the palisades," Ryle acknowledged. "I venture the sight of the Lee Guard will sap the will to fight from most, yet we shall see. We Phrenics can also be a determined lot, as you well know." He forced a small smile as he turned to his friend. Onder returned the expression in part. Both understood the concerns that darkened the expression. The hold over the stocks was tenuous at best. Time was not on their side. Ledral commanded a loyal yet vastly outnumbered force. Even with the addition of the soldiers from House Elegar, there were far fewer whom they could trust. The mercenaries, the hunters, the hired blades of the crumbling vestige of King Lunek's power had picked away at them day by day. With no tributes to chase, the hunters satiated their bloodlust on the lives of the survivors of the massacre that their king had wrought. It had been nearly 5 days since they disrupted the deliverance. Ryle expected that the floodgates would have opened that same day. Ledral, at the command of the newly constituted Cadsay Guard, had been expected to concede their fealty to the kingdom in exchange for pardon. All knew it would be neither given nor accepted. They would suffer a traitor's death. Ledral was a capable and competent commander. His comprehension of the threat that loomed was stout. There was no doubt that he'd have contingencies in place. He'd not sit idly as the hunters slaughtered those loyal to his cause. Like Ryle and his companions, they were drastically outnumbered. Ryle's eyes tracked a stray ember that swirled upward from the fire. He watched as the glowing ember landed on the back of his hand. It hissed as it made contact with his chilled skin. The pair remained silent, watching the greedy flames eat away at the wood as the moments stretched on. The sky was still shrouded in the thick darkness of the late night, yet clouds obscured any chance to see the stars. Ryle fought off the weariness as his mind reeled with worry. The Alexan struggled to keep the darkness at bay. He could feel the screams from within as the taint desperately fought to increase its hold. He'd have to relinquish his control of the darkness soon. The agonizing fear of the inversion of his tattoos was an unwelcome yet necessary task. Given the freedom from the power of the darkness that resided within his core, Would the attitudes of the Lee Guard shift? A stab of concern knifed through his body. At his side, Onder tensed as the external sensation affected him as well. Ryle felt the presence approach moments before he noted it with his mindsight. A Phrenic approached with haste. The others stirred where they slept, roused by the alarm. Cloaked in dark gray, nothing more than a darker shadow against the backdrop of the night, a solitary figure slipped silently from the tree line. Phrenic nodded as he neared their location. His movements were silent. "The scouts in the woods have retreated," he noted without preamble. "They found their target. Now they return to rejoin their host. It's time for you to get what rest you can. I fear your sleep will be interrupted." Chapter 2. Ryle found that rest came with little difficulty. He sat on his thin bedroll a few meters from the heat of the fire. His mindsight tracked the motion of the Lee Guard as he forced the Alexan back into his control. The pain was excruciating. The agony lingered for moments as he gingerly massaged his arm. He doubted the sensation was something he'd ever grow accustomed to. The sun, streaked with black, still blazed on his arm, yet the Lee Guard remained motionless. The Alexan wasted no time reclaiming the territory it had lost. It surged through his veins, spreading a calming warmth that bit through a layer of the chill that had permeated his body. There was an undeniable sensation of concern that followed in their wake. The whispering darkness still grumbled in his mind, yet the ferocity had diminished. He watched for a few moments, confirming that the Phrenics had reached their positions before laying his body down. The chill from the ground beneath the thin bedroll was profound. His body trembled from the cold. The sting of the inversion of his tattoos had yet to fade before sleep took hold. The muffled padding of footsteps on the ground around him snapped him from his slumber. Instinctively, the vision flashed before him as his mindsight scanned the area. He'd identified the positions of his Phrenic companions and the Lee Guard before his eyes could resolve the images in the murky light. Night had stretched beyond the lengthy transition from inky blackness to deep violet. The trill of the insects had silenced. A low moan of the wind sang in the background. The vision at hand was alarming. "Ryle, get up." Nilix slid to a stop at his side. The anxiety in his voice was unrestrained. A heavy sensation of concern washed over Ryle, pulsing from the Phrenics, who were all on the move. Ryle reached his feet before the vigil could offer a hand to assist. His slumber couldn't have lasted more than an hour. He knew the weariness would rear its head again, and soon, yet for the moment his adrenaline and the agitation of the Alexan overpowered his tiredness. The image his mindsight presented was frantic. His heart raced as the signatures showed motion, yet the intent was unknown. The glowing orbs that represented the Phrenics hastened to surround their group. The black mass of the Lee Guard churned violently, agitated by some unseen force. Ryle steeled himself, readying his surging emotions to combat the debilitating assault of the black-cloaked warriors. His left hand squeezed its grip on the wooden shaft, wrenching a single of the leaves from the holster behind his back. The gust of wind swelled around his right arm. "Nilix, take Dav, stay with Potter," he ordered, knowing the vigil, whose trust had once been in question, whose dereliction had caused the death of a Phrenic, would follow without hesitation. He crossed beyond the fragile halo of the dying fire in a bound, joining the constricting ring of his Phrenic companions. The black signatures of the Lee Guard froze for a moment as he reached his position between Phrenic and Ram. A high-pitched whistle shrieked through the night. He knew the sound. "Arrows!" he screamed as the torrent of wind whipped around his right arm. From slightly behind his position, the sky flashed with a swelling orange light. He followed the crackle of fire and trail of smoke as Vox's fireball hurtled overhead. Ryle dipped into the speed in his veins as the ball of flame detonated in the air a few dozen meters to their front. The wash of searing heat had yet to reach their position as he released the wind that swelled around his arm. The flame had illuminated the flight of arrows still meters beyond the reach of the explosion. They were well past their apex, descending rapidly. The bolts would fall well short of his position, yet the Lee Guard would take the brunt of the assault. He slashed his right hand across the sky.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?